Benedict Nwachukwu stepped out of his black SUV into the chaos of a Lagos street, and suddenly the world stopped. Across the road stood the woman he had once divorced, Adaeze. The same woman doctors had sworn could never bear a child, but now her dress stretched tightly over a swollen, pregnant belly. Benedict's breath caught in his throat. Cars honked, vendors shouted, people rushed past. Yet all he could see was her. His hands began to shake, because if Adaeze was truly pregnant, then the decision that destroyed their marriage might have been the greatest mistake of his life, and what he would soon learn about the past would bring him to his knees. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if stories about love, justice, and second chances move your heart, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next story. The city of Lagos never truly slept. Even in the quiet hours just before sunrise, the distant hum of generators, the rumble of early buses, and the restless voices of traders preparing their stalls drifted through the air like a constant pulse. It was a city that demanded motion, ambition, and endurance. Few people understood that rhythm better than Benedict Nwachukwu. At 39 years old, Benedict had built a life that many Nigerians admired. His logistics company, Nwachukwu Freight and Transport, had grown from a single rented truck to a respected regional business that handled shipments across several West African countries. His offices sat in a tall glass building on Victoria Island. His black SUVs moved through Lagos traffic with quiet authority. His name appeared in business magazines beside headlines about rising African entrepreneurs. To the outside world, Benedict Nwachukwu was a success story. But success did not always mean peace. On most mornings, Benedict woke before the sun rose over the Lagos lagoon. He would stand silently on the balcony of his spacious apartment, coffee growing cold in his hands while the city slowly came alive beneath him. The view was beautiful. Yet the silence inside his home felt strangely hollow. The apartment was too large for one man, too quiet, too empty. Sometimes when the early morning light reflected against the glass walls, Benedict felt an old memory pushing into his mind, one he had spent years trying to bury. A memory of laughter, of warm food cooking in a small kitchen, of a woman's voice singing softly while folding laundry. Her name was Adaeze Okafor. For a long time, Benedict had trained himself not to think about her. Work had helped. Work was relentless. Meetings, contracts, shipments, negotiations with customs officials, endless phone calls with partners in Accra and Abidjan. The business world left little room for reflection, but memory had a strange way of returning when a man least expected it, especially in quiet moments. This morning, like many others, Benedict pushed the thoughts away and prepared for the day ahead. His driver, Emeka, waited downstairs beside the car. "Good morning," Sir Emeka greeted respectfully as Benedict approached. "Morning," Benedict replied. The driver opened the rear door of the SUV, and Benedict slid inside while already checking messages on his phone. The schedule for the day was heavy. A meeting with investors, a shipment dispute at a Papa port, a lunch appointment with a government official. Business never paused in Lagos. The car merged into traffic, weaving between buses painted in bright yellow and vendors, walking between vehicles balancing trays of bread and bottled water. Benedict barely noticed. His mind was already occupied with numbers, contracts, and logistics routes. For years, this routine had protected him from something deeper, from regret. But regret had never completely disappeared. Sometimes it appeared in strange ways. At family gatherings, for example, Benedict's mother, Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu, lived in their family compound in Enugu, where most of the extended relatives still gathered for holidays. Whenever Benedict visited, the same question always found its way into conversation. "When will you marry again?" his aunties would ask with knowing smiles. "You need a son to carry the family name," one uncle once added bluntly. Mama Ngozi rarely spoke loudly about it, but her expectations were always present. Benedict had once tried dating again after the divorce. Several women had come into his life, some introduced by family friends, others through business circles. But something never felt right. Some seemed more interested in his wealth than his heart. Others simply did not understand the quiet sadness that sometimes lingered in him. Eventually, Benedict stopped trying. It was easier to focus on business, easier to avoid conversations about the past. Yet despite the years that had passed, the story of his marriage still followed him like a shadow. Some people remembered, especially those who had known the early days of his life before money changed everything. Back then, Benedict had not been the powerful businessman people saw today. He had simply been a young man with ambition and a dream. And beside him had been Adaeze. They had met in Enugu, long before Lagos became Benedict's home. Adaeze had worked in a small pharmacy near the university while Benedict was struggling to build his first transport contract with a borrowed truck. She had been patient when money was tight. She had believed in him when others laughed at his plans. In those days, their house had been small, but it had been full of warmth. Friends used to say, Adaeze's laughter could brighten any room. Benedict used to believe nothing could ever break what they had built together, but life rarely moved according to human certainty. Somewhere along the way, the quiet happiness of their home had begun to change. It started with small questions. Questions that came from relatives during visits. When will we hear good news? When will we celebrate a baby? At first the questions seemed harmless, but as the months turned into years, they began to carry heavier meaning. The pressure grew. Doctor visits followed. Tests, waiting rooms, silent drives home. Eventually, the joy that once filled their house slowly began to fade. Though Benedict rarely admitted it aloud, those years had been the beginning of the distance that would later destroy everything. The SUV stopped in front of Benedict's office building. Emeka turned slightly from the driver's seat. "We're here, sir." Benedict blinked, pulled back from his thoughts. All right. He stepped out of the car and walked into the glass building, where employees greeted him respectfully. "Good morning, sir. Morning, Mr. Nwachukwu." He nodded politely as he passed through the lobby. Inside the conference room upstairs, several executives were already waiting. Documents were spread across the polished table. The meeting began immediately. For the next several hours, Benedict was completely immersed in business negotiations, contracts, shipping schedules, port regulations. It was the world he had mastered, the world where he felt strong and respected. But sometime in the middle of the meeting, something unexpected happened. A junior manager accidentally mentioned a topic that had nothing to do with shipping routes or cargo permits. It was a casual remark. "My wife just gave birth last week," the young man said proudly, while explaining why he had missed a previous meeting. Laughter filled the room. Congratulations followed. But Benedict felt something inside him tighten. He forced a polite smile. "Congratulations," he said calmly. Yet for a brief moment, a quiet emptiness opened inside his chest. He quickly returned his attention to the documents on the table. Business continued. Numbers filled the room again. But somewhere deep inside Benedict Nwachukwu's mind, a question he had avoided for years stirred once more. What if things had been different? What if the past had taken another path? For now, those thoughts remained buried. But the truth was already moving toward him. And before the day ended, Benedict would see something on a crowded Lagos street that would shake the foundation of everything he believed about his past. Something impossible, something that would force him to confront the memory of Adaeze Okafor, the woman he once called his wife. Years before, Lagos knew the name Benedict Nwachukwu. He had been just another young man in Enugu, chasing a future that often felt just beyond his reach. Back then, Benedict owned almost nothing. He rented a single small room behind a mechanic workshop. The walls were thin, the ceiling leaked during heavy rains, and the noise of metal tools striking engines filled the air from morning until evening. Yet Benedict carried something more valuable than comfort. He carried belief. Every morning, he woke before sunrise, ironing the same 2 shirts he rotated during the week, and left the room with determination burning quietly inside him. At the time, he had only one aging truck borrowed with money from a distant uncle, and a small contract transporting bags of cement between towns. It was not much, but Benedict treated it like the beginning of something larger. It was during those early years that he met Adaeze Okafor. The first time Benedict saw her was outside a modest pharmacy near the University of Nigeria campus. Adaeze stood behind the counter, helping an elderly woman understand how to take her medication. Her voice was gentle, patient, and calm, in a way that made people feel safe. Benedict had walked in with a headache that afternoon, after a long drive transporting cement. But what he remembered most later was not the medicine she handed him. It was the way she smiled. It was warm, real, not the polite smile of someone forced to greet customers. When Benedict returned the next week to buy more medicine, he realized something surprising. He was not sure he actually needed the medicine, but he had wanted to see her again. Their conversations began simply. At first they spoke about ordinary things, traffic work, and the noisy market nearby. Adaeze laughed easily, and Benedict discovered that her laughter made even the most exhausting day feel lighter. Soon, he began stopping by the pharmacy more often, sometimes after work, sometimes during his lunch break. It did not take long for the friendship to grow into something deeper. Adaeze admired Benedict's determination. She listened patiently when he talked about his dream of building a transportation company that would connect cities across Nigeria. Most people would have laughed at such an idea from a man with only one truck, but Adaeze never laughed. "You speak about your future like it is already real," she once told him. Benedict shrugged with a shy smile. "If I don't believe it first, who will?" Adaeze nodded thoughtfully. "I believe it." That simple sentence stayed in Benedict's heart for years. Their relationship grew slowly and naturally. They began spending evenings walking through the lively streets near the campus, sharing roasted corn from roadside vendors, while talking about the future. Adaeze's dreams were simple. She wanted a peaceful home, children running through the house, a husband who respected her. She did not care about wealth, she cared about love. Benedict felt the same. When he finally asked her to marry him, he did it without expensive rings or grand gestures. They sat together under a large mango tree near Adaeze's family home. The evening sky glowed orange as the sun disappeared behind the hills. "Adaeze," Benedict said quietly, his voice steady but nervous. "My life is not easy right now." She smiled softly. "I know. I cannot promise you luxury yet. I know that too." Benedict took a slow breath. "But I promise I will never stop trying to build a better life for us." Adaeze looked at him with warm eyes. "Benedict, I don't want a perfect life," she said gently. "I just want a real one." He reached for her hand. "Will you marry me?" Adaeze laughed softly, though tears shone in her eyes. Yes. Their wedding was small but joyful. Family members gathered in a modest church in Enugu. There were no expensive decorations, no famous guests, no lavish reception hall. But the room overflowed with singing, dancing, and celebration. Friends teased Benedict about his serious face during the ceremony. Adaeze could not stop smiling. For a long time after the wedding, life remained simple. They moved into a small 2-bedroom house near the edge of town. The furniture was basic. Sometimes money was tight, but happiness filled the space between them. Adaeze cooked meals while Benedict worked long hours building his transport business. Often he returned home late at night covered in dust from the road. Yet Adaeze always greeted him with warmth. "You look like you fought a war with the highway," she joked once, brushing cement dust from his shirt. Benedict laughed. Sometimes it feels like that, but he never complained, because he believed their sacrifices would lead somewhere better. And slowly, that belief began to come true. Within 3 years, Benedict managed to buy a second truck, then a third. His reputation grew. Businesses began trusting him with larger contracts. Money started flowing more steadily. With success came the possibility of something they both longed for, a family. At first the topic came up gently. One evening as they sat eating dinner, Adaeze looked up shyly. "Have you ever thought about what our children will look like?" she asked. Benedict smiled. "All the time. Do you want boys or girls?" He pretended to think deeply. "Maybe one boy and one girl." Adaeze laughed. "Only 2, maybe 3, Benedict admitted, "or 4 if they behave." Their laughter filled the house. Those conversations became frequent. They imagined names. They imagined school uniforms. They imagined birthday celebrations and noisy family dinners. Months passed, then a year. At first, they did not worry. Many couples took time before having children, but slowly, small concerns began to appear. Another year passed. Still nothing. Adaeze visited a doctor for the first time. The doctor said everything seemed normal. Sometimes these things simply take time. He reassured them, so they waited and waited. Friends began announcing pregnancies. Relatives started asking questions. "When will we hear good news?" one aunt asked during a visit. Adaeze forced a polite smile. "Soon, by God's grace." At night when they were alone, she sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling. Benedict would wrap an arm around her gently. "It will happen," he whispered. She nodded, but a small shadow had begun to form in their hearts. It was still faint, still distant, yet neither of them realized that this quiet uncertainty would soon grow into the storm that would eventually tear their marriage apart. For now they continued hoping, continued praying, continued believing that their dreams of a family were simply waiting for the right moment to arrive. Neither Benedict nor Adaeze could imagine that the future would soon place them on a path of heartbreak, pressure, and decisions that would haunt them for years. And the love that once felt unbreakable was slowly beginning to face its greatest test. At first, the pressure came quietly. So quietly that neither Benedict Nwachukwu nor Adaeze Okafor noticed when the gentle questions began turning into uncomfortable expectations. In the early years of their marriage, family members simply asked about children with smiles and laughter. "When will we hear good news?" an aunt would say playfully during a visit. Adaeze would laugh politely. "Soon, by God's grace." Benedict would squeeze her hand under the table, silently reassuring her. But as time passed, the tone began to change. 3 years after their wedding, the questions grew sharper. 4 years after the smiles disappeared. 5 years after the whispers began. It was during one of the annual family gatherings in Enugu that Adaeze first felt the full weight of those whispers. The Nwachukwu compound buzzed with relatives who had traveled from different towns for the holiday celebration. Children ran through the courtyard chasing each other, while women prepared large pots of jollof rice and pepper soup over outdoor fires. At first, the atmosphere felt joyful. Adaeze helped Benedict's cousins arrange plates while greeting older relatives respectfully. But as the afternoon passed, she began noticing certain looks, glances exchanged between elderly women, quiet conversations that suddenly stopped when she walked closer. She tried to ignore it, until one of Benedict's distant aunties approached her with a smile that felt strangely sharp. "Adaeze, my daughter," the woman said, lowering her voice. "You have been married for many years now." Adaeze nodded politely. "Yes, Mama." The woman leaned closer. "And yet we have not seen a baby." Adaeze felt her chest tighten slightly, but kept her composure. "We are praying," she replied gently. The woman sighed dramatically. Prayer is good, but sometimes other things must also be considered. Adaeze did not respond. Instead, she excused herself and walked toward the back of the compound where Benedict stood, speaking with a group of male relatives. The moment she reached his side, the tension eased slightly. Benedict always had that effect. When he stood beside her, Adaeze felt protected, but even Benedict could not fully silence the expectations of tradition. Later that evening, while most guests were busy eating, Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu called Benedict aside. His mother had always been a commanding presence, tall, dignified, and known for speaking her mind without hesitation. Mama Ngozi believed strongly in family legacy, and in Igbo culture, legacy meant children, specifically sons. "Benedict," she said quietly, folding her arms as they stood near the edge of the compound. "Yes, Mama." She studied him carefully. "You have been married for 5 years, I know, and still there is no child." Benedict shifted uncomfortably. "We are working on it." Mama Ngozi shook her head, slowly. "My son, time is moving." He remained silent. "You are the first son of this family," she continued. "Your father's name must continue." "Mama, what will happen to our lineage if there is no child?" The words settled heavily between them. Benedict had heard similar comments before, but hearing them from his mother carried a different weight. "Adaeze is trying," he said carefully. Mama Ngozi's expression hardened. "Trying is not the same as succeeding." Benedict felt irritation rising. "She is my wife, and I respect that," Mama Ngozi replied calmly. "But a wife must also bring children." That evening, Benedict returned to Lagos with Adaeze in silence. The long drive back felt heavier than usual. Adaeze stared quietly out the window, watching the highway lights pass by. She did not ask what his mother had said. She already knew. When they arrived home, Benedict tried to lighten the mood. "Don't worry about what people say," he told her gently. Adaeze nodded. "I'm not worried." But Benedict could hear the sadness beneath her words. The months that followed brought more pressure. Some relatives became openly critical. Others pretended sympathy while spreading rumors behind Adaze's back. "She must be barren," someone whispered at a wedding. "I heard Benedict may marry again," another said. Eventually, the whispers reached Adaeze. Each word felt like a small knife. Still, she endured with quiet strength. She continued caring for their home, continued supporting Benedict's growing business, continued smiling in public even when her heart felt heavy. But the pressure did not remain outside the house. Slowly, it began, entering their marriage. Benedict tried to remain supportive, yet he was not immune to the expectations surrounding him. Friends teased him casually. "You are becoming too rich to remain without children," one business partner joked. Another laughed. "Be careful before your family finds you another wife." At first, Benedict brushed off such comments, but over time the repetition began planting doubt. Late at night, he sometimes found himself staring at the ceiling while Adaeze slept beside him. What if the problem never changed? What if they never had children? What would happen to the Nwachukwu name? He hated himself for even thinking those thoughts, because when he looked at Adaeze, he still saw the woman who had stood beside him when he had nothing. Yet the pressure from the outside world continued growing. Eventually, Benedict suggested something that neither of them truly wanted. "Maybe we should visit another specialist," he said one evening. Adaeze looked up from the kitchen table where she had been reviewing some pharmacy records. "Another doctor, just to be sure." She hesitated. They had already seen 2 doctors over the years. Both had offered vague answers. "Sometimes it takes time," Stress can affect fertility. Keep trying. But none had provided clear explanations. Adaeze nodded slowly. All right. A few weeks later, they traveled to a well-known fertility clinic in Lagos. The building looked modern and professional. Inside, the waiting room was filled with couples wearing similar expressions of hope and worry. After several hours of tests and consultations, they finally met the specialist. His name was Dr. Chinedu Okoye. He was a respected fertility expert with years of experience. He spoke calmly and confidently while reviewing their medical records. More tests followed: blood work, scans, long waiting periods. Adaeze remained quiet throughout the process. Benedict held her hand whenever he could. They both hoped the doctor would offer reassurance, a solution. But weeks later, when they returned for the final consultation, the atmosphere in the office felt strangely heavy. Dr. Okoye sat behind his desk, studying the test results carefully. Finally, he looked up. "I'm afraid the results are not encouraging." Adaeze's heart began beating faster. "What do you mean?" Benedict asked. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Nwachukwu has a severe reproductive condition that makes natural pregnancy extremely unlikely." Adaeze felt the words hit her like a wave. "Unlikely," she whispered. Dr. Okoye nodded. "In my professional opinion, carrying a child may not be possible." Silence filled the room. Benedict felt the air leave his lungs. Adaeze stared at the floor, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. In that moment, something fragile inside their marriage began to crack. Neither of them fully understood it yet. But the diagnosis from Dr. Chinedu Okoye would soon become the weapon that outside forces would use to destroy everything they had built together. And the pressure surrounding Benedict Nwachukwu was only beginning. The drive home from the clinic felt longer than any journey Benedict Nwachukwu had ever taken. Lagos traffic moved slowly that afternoon. Cars packed tightly together as vendors walked between lanes selling bottled water, phone chargers, and roasted plantains. The city buzzed with its usual restless energy. But inside Benedict's car, there was only silence. Adaeze sat beside him, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The words of Dr. Chinedu Okoye still echoed inside the small space between them. Carrying a child may not be possible. Benedict kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Beside him, Adaeze stared through the window as if the busy city outside had suddenly become distant and unreal. Eventually, Benedict cleared his throat. The doctor said unlikely, he said carefully. Not impossible. Adaeze nodded slowly. Yes, but her voice carried no confidence. They both knew what the doctor truly meant. When they reached their house, Adaeze walked inside quietly and placed her handbag on the table. Normally, she would move straight to the kitchen or ask Benedict about his day. But that afternoon, she simply sat down. The silence in the room felt heavy. Benedict stood near the doorway for a moment before speaking again. "We can get a second opinion," he said. Adaeze forced a small smile. "We already did." He knew she was right. They had already visited 2 other doctors over the years. All of them had given uncertain answers. But Dr. Okoye had been different. His diagnosis had sounded final. Adaeze stood up slowly and walked toward the bedroom. "I need to lie down for a while," she said softly. Benedict nodded. "Of course." He watched her disappear down the hallway. For a long time, he remained standing in the living room alone. That night, Adaeze cried quietly while Benedict pretended to sleep beside her. He did not know how to comfort her. Because the truth was, he did not know how to comfort himself either. The following weeks felt strangely different inside their home. Adaeze still carried out her daily routines. She cooked meals, she cleaned the house, she went to work at the pharmacy. But something inside her had changed. The easy laughter that once filled the house had grown rare. Sometimes Benedict caught her staring silently at mothers walking with children on the street. Sometimes he heard her praying softly late at night. Benedict tried to remain supportive, but outside their home, the pressure was already growing. News of the diagnosis did not stay private for long. In Nigerian families, especially close ones like the Nwachukwu clan, personal matters rarely remained hidden. Someone always knew, someone always talked, and eventually the news reached Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu. The phone call came on a Sunday evening. Benedict had just returned from a business meeting when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and sighed quietly. "Mama," he answered. "Good evening, Mama." Benedict, his mother's voice, replied firmly. "I heard something today." His chest tightened. "What did you hear?" "That you and Adaeze visited a fertility clinic." Benedict rubbed his forehead. "Who told you that? That is not important," she said sharply. "Is it true?" He hesitated for a moment. "Yes," and Benedict closed his eyes. "The doctor says it may be difficult for her to have children." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mama Ngozi spoke again, her voice had lost all warmth. "So it is true." "Mama, I warned you before the wedding," she interrupted. Benedict felt irritation rising. "You warned me about that the girl may not be right for our family." Benedict straightened. "That's not fair." "Not fair," Mama Ngozi replied. 5 years of marriage and no child. Now the doctors confirm it. It's not her fault. Fault or not, the result is the same. Benedict remained silent. Mama Ngozi's tone grew colder. "You are the first son of the Nwachukwu family. Your father's name must continue." "I know. Then you must start thinking about your future." Benedict felt anger creeping into his voice. "My future includes my wife." His mother sighed heavily. "My son, sometimes love is not enough." Benedict did not respond, but the words stayed with him long after the call ended. Over the next few months, the pressure from his family intensified. Mama Ngozi called more frequently. Relatives began offering advice. Some suggestions were subtle, others were blunt. "You are still young," one uncle told him during a visit to Enugu. "You can marry again." Another relative spoke even more directly. "A man in your position cannot remain childless forever." Each conversation planted another seed of doubt in Benedict's mind. At home, Adaeze sensed the change. One evening while preparing dinner, she looked at him carefully. "You've been very quiet lately," she said. Benedict forced a smile. "Just work stress." But Adaeze knew him too well. "Did your mother call again?" He hesitated. "Yes, and she's just worried." Adaeze nodded slowly. "Of course she is." There was no bitterness in her voice, only sadness. That night as they lay in bed, Adaeze spoke softly. "If you ever feel trapped in this marriage because of me," she said, "you should tell me." Benedict turned toward her quickly. "What are you talking about? I don't want to be the reason your family name ends." "Adaeze, I mean it," she continued quietly. "You deserve the chance to have children." Benedict shook his head firmly. "I married you, not a future child." Adaeze smiled faintly, but deep inside she already feared the truth, because the world around them was slowly convincing Benedict that love alone was not enough. Months passed. The distance between them grew gradually, not because Benedict stopped caring, but because doubt had begun to creep into places where certainty once lived. Family gatherings became uncomfortable. Mama Ngozi rarely spoke kindly to Adaeze anymore. During one particularly tense visit, she made a comment loud enough for several relatives to hear. "A home without children is only half a home." Adaeze lowered her eyes politely, but the words cut deeply. Benedict heard them too, yet he said nothing, and in that moment something inside Adaeze quietly broke. because the man who once defended her without hesitation had begun to remain silent. Neither of them realized that this silence would soon lead to the decision that would destroy their marriage completely. The diagnosis from Dr. Chinedu Okoye had done more than bring sadness. It had opened the door for doubt, for pressure, for fear, and before long, Benedict Nwachukwu would be forced to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The months that followed the diagnosis from Dr. Chinedu Okoye changed the atmosphere inside Benedict and Adaeze's home in ways that were difficult to explain. Nothing dramatic happened at first. There were no loud arguments, no sudden explosions of anger. Instead, the change came slowly, like a quiet crack forming in a wall that no one noticed until the structure itself began to weaken. At the beginning, Benedict Nwachukwu tried to maintain normalcy. He continued focusing on expanding his logistics business. New contracts were coming in, and his company had begun transporting goods between Lagos, Onitsha, and Port Harcourt. From the outside, life looked successful. But at home, silence had begun replacing warmth. Adaeze still woke early to prepare breakfast before Benedict left for work. She still ironed his shirts carefully and packed his lunch. But the laughter that once filled their kitchen had grown rare. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. Both of them were trying not to touch the invisible wound that now lived between them. And the pressure from Benedict's family was growing stronger. One evening, Benedict returned home from work to find his phone ringing repeatedly. When he checked the screen, he saw several missed calls from Mama Ngozi. He knew exactly what that meant. He stepped onto the balcony and called her back. "Mama, my son," she replied immediately. "Where have you been at work? I have been trying to reach you all afternoon. I was in meetings." There was a brief pause. Then she spoke again, her tone calm but firm. "Benedict, we need to talk about your future." He closed his eyes slowly. "We have already talked about this." "No," she said. "You have avoided the conversation." Benedict leaned against the balcony railing. "Mama Adaeze is my wife, and she will always be respected." Mama Ngozi replied smoothly. "But respect does not give this family grandchildren." Benedict rubbed his forehead. "We don't know that for sure. The doctor told you the truth." "Mama, you cannot pretend forever," she interrupted. "The family elders are asking questions." Benedict's chest tightened. "What elders? You know how our family works," she said. "Your uncles are concerned about the future of the Nwachukwu name." He did not respond. Mama Ngozi lowered her voice. "There are good women in our community, Benedict." His stomach turned. "Mama, you are still young," she continued. "You can start again." "Start again," he repeated bitterly. "You can take another wife." Benedict felt anger rising in his chest. "I am not divorcing my wife." There was silence for several seconds. Then Mama Ngozi spoke again. "You may not want to do it," she said quietly. "But one day you will realize that love cannot replace a child." The call ended shortly afterward. Benedict remained on the balcony for a long time. Inside the house, Adaeze had finished preparing dinner. She waited at the table with 2 plates already served. When Benedict finally walked back inside, she looked up. "Was that your mother?" "Yes." "What did she say?" Benedict hesitated. "Nothing important." Adaeze studied his face carefully. But she did not push further. Instead, she simply nodded. "Dinner is getting cold." They ate quietly. The distance between them felt heavier than ever. A few weeks later, the situation worsened. Benedict traveled to Enugu for a family gathering that he could not avoid. Adaeze stayed in Lagos, saying she needed to work. In truth, she had grown tired of the uncomfortable glances and whispered conversations that always followed her during family events. When Benedict arrived at the compound, he quickly realized the gathering had another purpose. The family elders were waiting. His uncles sat together under the large mango tree in the courtyard. Mama Ngozi stood nearby, her expression serious. Benedict, one of the older men, called. "Come sit with us." He felt uneasy as he approached. Once seated, the conversation began politely. They asked about his business, about the Lagos economy, about transport routes. But eventually the topic shifted. One of his uncles cleared his throat. "My son," the older man said slowly, "we have heard about the situation with your wife." Benedict felt his shoulders tense. "Yes." The elder nodded thoughtfully. "These things happen sometimes." Benedict said nothing, but our family must continue. The words fell heavily. Another uncle spoke. "You are the first son of your father. The responsibility is yours." "I know. So what is your plan?" Benedict stared at the ground for a moment. "I don't have a plan." Mama Ngozi stepped forward. "That is the problem," she said firmly. Benedict looked up. "Mama, you are waiting for something that may never come." Benedict felt frustration rising. "Adaeze is not a problem that needs to be solved." "But the situation is," his mother replied. He looked around at the faces of his relatives. They all seemed to share the same silent expectation. It was not hatred. It was not cruelty. It was tradition. And tradition could be unforgiving. One uncle leaned forward slightly. "You can take a second wife," he suggested calmly. "You would not be the first man to do so." Benedict shook his head. "I will not humiliate Adaeze like that." Another elder spoke. "Then perhaps it is time to release her." The words hung in the air. Release her. A gentle phrase for something far more painful. Benedict stood up suddenly. "I cannot make that decision today." The elders exchanged quiet looks. Mama Ngozi spoke again, her voice softer now. "My son, sometimes love requires sacrifice." Benedict left the gathering shortly afterward. The drive back to Lagos felt endless. For the first time since the diagnosis, the pressure around him felt impossible to ignore. By the time he arrived home, it was late at night. Adaeze was sitting in the living room waiting for him. "You're back," she said quietly. "Yes." He placed his keys on the table. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Adaeze looked up at him. "Did they ask you to leave me?" Benedict froze. "How did you know?" She smiled sadly. "Because they have been asking that question for years." He sat down slowly. "I told them no." Adaeze looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke softly. "But how long can you keep saying no?" Benedict had no answer. The silence between them grew heavy again, and in that moment, both of them felt the truth approaching. The love that had once seemed unbreakable was now standing at the edge of a decision neither of them truly wanted to make. But very soon, that decision would arrive. And when it did, Benedict Nwachukwu would make a choice that would destroy the life he once believed could never fall apart. The night after Benedict returned from Enugu, neither he nor Adaeze Okafor slept well. The house felt unusually quiet, as if even the walls understood that something important had changed. Benedict lay on his back, staring at the ceiling long after midnight. The fan spun slowly above him, pushing warm air around the room. But it did nothing to calm the storm in his mind. The voices from the family gathering replayed again and again. "Our family must continue. You are the first son. Perhaps it is time to release her." Benedict turned his head slightly. Adaeze lay beside him, facing the opposite wall. Her breathing was steady, but he knew she was not asleep either. Neither of them spoke. Morning arrived slowly. Adaeze rose first, as she always did. She moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing tea and bread for breakfast. The familiar routine felt strangely fragile now. When Benedict entered the kitchen, she looked up and forced a small smile. "Good morning." "Morning." They sat together at the small table. For several minutes, only the soft sound of spoons touching cups broke the silence. Finally, Adaeze spoke. "You should go to work early today," she said gently. Benedict frowned slightly. "Why you've been distracted lately? Your company needs you focused." He studied her face. "You're trying to avoid this conversation." Adaeze sighed softly. "I'm trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From feeling guilty." Benedict set his cup down. "Adaeze." She raised a hand gently. "Please let me finish." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes carried deep exhaustion. "I have been thinking a lot these past few months," she continued, "about our marriage, about everything we've been through." Benedict listened quietly. "You married me when you had nothing," she said. "We struggled together. We built a life together." He nodded slowly. "Yes. But now you are no longer the young man with one truck and a dream." Benedict's chest tightened. "You've built something big," she said softly. "Your family sees it. Your community sees it. That doesn't change how I feel about you." Adaeze gave a faint smile. "I know." Then she lowered her eyes. "But it changes what people expect from you." The words hung between them. Benedict suddenly felt uneasy. "Why are you talking like this?" Adaeze took a slow breath. "Because I don't want to watch you slowly become resentful." "I'm not resentful. Not yet." Benedict looked away. Outside, the sounds of Lagos traffic were beginning to grow louder. Adaeze spoke again. "Your mother is not wrong about one thing." He looked back at her. "What thing? You deserve to have children." Benedict's voice hardened. "And I deserve to have the wife I love." Adaeze's eyes softened. "But what if loving me is costing you the future your family expects?" Benedict felt frustration rising. "I'm tired of everyone deciding what my life should look like." "But they're not the only ones deciding," Adaeze replied quietly. "What do you mean?" Adaeze hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I have been making a decision too." Benedict felt a sudden chill. "What decision?" Adaeze looked directly at him. "I think we should separate." The words hit him like a physical blow, but she remained calm. "I think we should end the marriage." Benedict stood abruptly from his chair. "No! Adaeze!" "No," he repeated firmly. "This is not your decision to make alone." Adaeze's voice stayed steady. "I'm not making it alone. You just said we should separate. I'm saying it because I know you're afraid to." Benedict ran a hand through his hair. "This is madness." "No," Adaeze said softly. "It's honesty." He stared at her in disbelief. "You're giving up on us. I'm freeing you. I don't need to be freed." "But you are already trapped," she replied gently. Benedict paced across the small kitchen. "You think I care about what my relatives say?" "No," Adaeze said, "but I think you care about disappointing them." He stopped walking. She continued quietly. "You've spent months trying to pretend everything is fine. But I see the way you look at families with children. I see the way you grow quiet when your mother calls." Benedict could not deny it. "And every time someone asks about children," she added, "you become more tired." His voice softened. "Adaeze, we can still try other options." "Like what? Adoption?" She shook her head gently. "Your family would never accept that. Then they will learn." Adaeze gave a sad smile. "You know that's not true." Silence filled the room again. Finally she spoke. "I love you too much to watch you slowly lose yourself because of me." Benedict felt anger and heartbreak colliding inside him. "You think leaving me will fix that?" "No," she admitted, "but staying will make it worse." He looked at her helplessly. "Adaeze, we promised to face life together." "And we did," she said softly, "for a long time." Her eyes glistened slightly now, but sometimes love is not enough to fight the world around us. Benedict felt something inside him breaking. "I don't want this." Adaeze reached across the table and gently took his hand. "I know." Her voice trembled slightly for the first time. "But sometimes the hardest choices are the ones made out of love." A few weeks later, the divorce papers were signed quietly in a small legal office in Lagos. There were no dramatic arguments, no shouting, just signatures. Two lives that had once been deeply intertwined, slowly separating. When Adaeze walked out of the office that day, she carried only a small bag. Benedict watched her leave without saying anything. He wanted to call her name, wanted to ask her to stay. But the pressure of expectations, family, and fear had already pushed him too far down a road he did not know how to leave. That day, Benedict Nwachukwu lost the woman who had once believed in him more than anyone else. And though he did not fully understand it yet, it would become the greatest regret of his life. The months after the divorce passed with a strange quietness that neither Benedict Nwachukwu nor Adaeze Okafor had expected. For Benedict, life became louder. For Adaeze, life became quieter. In Lagos, Benedict threw himself into work with a level of intensity that surprised even his closest business partners. His logistics company expanded rapidly during that period. New contracts arrived from large construction firms transporting materials across Nigeria. Investors approached him with partnership opportunities. Within 2 years, Nwachukwu Freight and Transport had grown into one of the most reliable logistics firms operating between Lagos, Onitsha, and Port Harcourt. Success followed him everywhere. He moved into a larger apartment on Victoria Island. He bought new vehicles. His company name appeared in business newspapers. Yet the success carried a strange emptiness. The apartment felt too quiet at night. There was no laughter in the kitchen, no soft singing while someone folded laundry, and no one waiting by the window when he returned home after long days. Sometimes Benedict would stand on the balcony late at night staring at the lights reflecting across the Lagos lagoon. On those nights, memories returned uninvited. Adaeze's voice, Adaeze's smile, Adaeze's belief in him during the years when he had nothing. He tried not to think about it, but regret had a way of appearing in quiet moments. Meanwhile, Adaeze had disappeared into a completely different world. After leaving the house they had shared, she moved into a small rented room in Surulere, far from the neighborhoods where Benedict's business associates lived. She left the pharmacy job she once loved, not because she wanted to, but because too many people there knew the story of her marriage. Too many sympathetic looks, too many whispered questions. Starting over somewhere new felt easier. At first, life was difficult. Adaeze worked small temporary jobs, assisting at a small clinic, helping at a local food stall, and occasionally caring for elderly patients who needed someone to cook or clean. Money was tight, but Adaeze refused to let bitterness control her heart. Instead, she focused on something simpler: peace. She prayed often. She kept her life quiet. She avoided places where memories might hurt too deeply. Over time, she slowly built a small circle of acquaintances who knew nothing about her past. One of them was Mama Ifunanya, an elderly midwife who lived in the same neighborhood. Mama Ifunanya was known by everyone in the area. She had delivered hundreds of babies over the years and possessed the calm wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for families. The first time Adaeze met her was outside a small neighborhood clinic. Adaeze had been sitting on a bench waiting for a temporary job interview when Mama Ifunanya approached. "You look like someone carrying heavy thoughts," the old woman said kindly. Adaeze smiled politely. "Just a long day." Mama Ifunanya sat beside her. "Sometimes long days are not the real problem." Adaeze glanced at her with mild surprise. "You speak like a counselor." Mama Ifunanya chuckled softly. "No, I speak like an old woman who has seen many lives." Over the weeks that followed, the two women began speaking more often. Mama Ifunanya had a warm, motherly presence that made people feel safe, sharing their struggles. Eventually, Adaeze told her a small part of the truth. "My marriage ended," she said quietly one afternoon. Mama Ifunanya nodded calmly. "Marriage endings are never simple." Adaeze hesitated before adding the part that still hurt the most. "The doctors said I couldn't have children." The older woman studied her face thoughtfully. "And your husband believed them?" "Yes." Mama Ifunanya sighed softly. "Doctors are skilled people," she said. "But sometimes even doctors are wrong." Adaeze looked at her skeptically. "3 doctors said the same thing." The old woman shrugged gently. "Even 3 people can make the same mistake." Adaeze did not argue, but she did not believe it either. By then she had already accepted the idea that motherhood would never be part of her life, and strangely, she had made peace with that reality. What she could not forget, however, was the love that had once existed in her marriage. Even after everything that had happened, she never spoke badly about Benedict. To her, the divorce had been a tragedy, not a betrayal. Meanwhile, fate was quietly moving pieces into place that neither of them could yet see. One afternoon, several months later, Adaeze experienced something unexpected. She was helping carry supplies into the small clinic where she occasionally worked when a sudden wave of dizziness passed over her. The room spun briefly. She had to grab the edge of a table to steady herself. A young mechanic who had been delivering spare parts nearby noticed. His name was Tunde Balogun. "Madam, are you okay?" he asked quickly. Adaeze nodded weakly. "I'm fine." But her voice sounded uncertain. Tunde frowned. "You look like someone who hasn't eaten today." "I have." "Then maybe you need to sit." He pulled a chair toward her. Adaeze hesitated but eventually sat down. Mama Ifunanya happened to enter the room at that moment. She studied Adaeze carefully. "You look pale." "I'm all right," Adaeze insisted. But Mama Ifunanya was not convinced. She had spent too many years observing women's health to ignore small signs. "Come with me," she said gently. Adaeze sighed. "Mama, it's nothing." "Then it will take only a few minutes to prove that." Reluctantly, Adaeze followed her into the examination room. A few simple checks followed. Mama Ifunanya asked several quiet questions. Then she paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly in thought. "Have you been feeling tired lately?" "Yes." "Nausea?" Adaeze frowned. "A little." The older woman folded her arms. Adaeze noticed the expression immediately. What Mama Ifunanya looked at her calmly. "I think you should take a pregnancy test." Adaeze blinked in disbelief. "That's impossible." Perhaps the older woman replied gently. "But it is still worth checking." Adaeze almost laughed. 3 doctors had already told her she could never carry a child. The idea sounded absurd, yet something in Mama Ifunanya's calm certainty made her hesitate. And within the next hour, Adaeze's entire understanding of her own life would begin to shift in a way she never imagined possible. Because the quiet truth about her body was waiting to reveal itself. And when it did, it would eventually shake the life of Benedict Nwachukwu more violently than anything he had ever experienced. Adaeze stared at the small white test strip in her hand, as if it were an object from another world. For several long seconds she did not breathe. The tiny examination room inside the neighborhood clinic felt suddenly too small, too quiet, as if the air itself had paused. Across from her, Mama Ifunanya stood calmly beside the table, watching her with patient eyes. "Well," the older woman asked gently. Adaeze's voice came out as a whisper. It can't be right." She held up the test strip, her fingers trembling slightly. 2 clear lines, unmistakable, positive. Mama Ifunanya stepped closer and glanced at the result. "Yes," she said softly. "That is what it says." Adaeze shook her head slowly. "No, this is wrong. Mistakes can happen." Mama Ifunanya agreed calmly. but we will confirm it with a proper test. Adaeze lowered herself onto the small chair beside the table. Her heart was beating fast, too fast. For years, she had carried the certainty that motherhood was impossible for her. 3 doctors, 3 consultations, 3 confirmations. You cannot carry a child. The words had shaped every decision she had made since. They had shaped the end of her marriage. And now, suddenly this small plastic strip was challenging everything she believed. "I don't understand," she murmured. Mama Ifunanya placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That is why we will not rely on this alone." Within the hour, they arranged for a more thorough medical examination at a larger clinic nearby. Adaeze walked there in a daze. The streets of Surulere bustled as usual. Okada motorcycles weaving between cars, traders shouting prices at roadside stalls, school children laughing in groups. But the world around her felt strangely distant. Inside the clinic, a young female doctor greeted them professionally. Her name was Dr. Zainab Musa. After listening carefully to Adaeze's explanation, the doctor raised her eyebrows slightly. "You were previously diagnosed as infertile, yes. How long ago?" "Almost 3 years." Dr. Musa nodded thoughtfully. "Let's run a full examination before drawing conclusions." More tests followed, blood samples, ultrasound scans. Adaeze lay quietly on the examination bed while the machine hummed softly beside her. She tried not to think, tried not to hope. Hope felt dangerous. Hope had once broken her heart. But when Dr. Musa studied the ultrasound monitor, her expression slowly changed. She turned the screen slightly toward Adaeze. "There is something you should see." Adaeze forced herself to look. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. Then Dr. Musa pointed gently at a small shape on the screen. "That," the doctor said calmly, "is your baby." The words echoed in the room. Adaeze's breath caught in her throat. "My baby," Dr. Musa nodded. "You are approximately 3 months pregnant." Adaeze felt tears rise instantly. For several seconds she could not speak. Her mind raced through memories, doctor visits, painful conversations, the moment she had signed divorce papers. All of it had been built on the belief that this moment could never happen. And yet the evidence was glowing clearly on the screen. "How is this possible?" she whispered. Dr. Musa turned back to the medical reports. "There are several possibilities," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes reproductive conditions improve naturally over time. Sometimes previous diagnoses were incomplete or incorrect." Adaeze shook her head slowly. But the specialist was very certain. Dr. Musa shrugged gently. "Even specialists can make mistakes." Mama Ifunanya smiled softly from across the room. "I told you doctors are not always perfect." Adaeze laughed weakly through her tears. For the first time in years, a strange new emotion filled her chest. Hope. Yet that hope carried fear as well. "Is the pregnancy healthy?" she asked. Dr. Musa studied the monitor again. "The baby appears stable," she said. "But I must be honest, your medical history means we should monitor this pregnancy very carefully." Adaeze nodded immediately. "I'll do anything." Dr. Musa gave a reassuring smile. "That's exactly the attitude you need." As they left the clinic later that afternoon, Adaeze walked slowly beside Mama Ifunanya. The sunlight felt warmer than usual. The sounds of Lagos seemed brighter. For years, she had believed that motherhood was forever closed to her. Now life had opened that door in the most unexpected way. Yet as the excitement settled slightly, another thought quietly entered her mind. Benedict. She stopped walking. Mama Ifunanya noticed immediately. "What is it?" Adaeze looked down at her hands. "He doesn't know." The old woman nodded. "That is true." Adaeze's voice trembled slightly. "Our marriage ended because we believed I couldn't have children." Mama Ifunanya studied her face, carefully. And now you can. Adaeze swallowed. What should I do? The older woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked a gentle question. What do you want to do? Adaeze thought about it for a long moment. The memories of her marriage returned clearly. Benedict's kindness, his ambition, his love during the early years, and the painful distance that had grown later. I don't want to reopen old wounds, she said finally. Mama Ifunanya nodded slowly. Then perhaps you should focus on your future. Adaeze placed a hand over her stomach. My child deserves peace. Yes, Mama Ifunanya said softly. That is the most important thing. Meanwhile, across the city in Victoria Island, Benedict Nwachukwu had no idea that the foundation of his past was quietly beginning to shift. That afternoon, he sat inside a sleek conference room, surrounded by investors discussing a new transport expansion project. Charts covered the screen. Numbers filled the conversation. Everyone spoke about profit, growth, market opportunity. But Benedict's mind was strangely restless. He found himself distracted by a thought he could not explain. A faint memory. Adaeze standing in the doorway of their old house in Enugu, smiling, believing in him. He pushed the memory away and returned his focus to the meeting. Because the past, he believed, had already been settled. The decisions had already been made. The marriage had already ended. But fate was quietly preparing to prove that the past was not as simple as Benedict believed. Very soon, he would see something on a busy Lagos street that would shatter his understanding of everything that had happened. And the truth, waiting behind that moment, would be far more painful than anything he could imagine. The afternoon heat in Lagos hung thick over the city like a heavy blanket. Traffic crawled slowly along Ikoyi Road, where luxury offices, banks, and expensive apartments stood beside the restless energy of street vendors weaving between vehicles. Inside the back seat of a black SUV, Benedict Nwachukwu leaned slightly forward, reviewing documents on his tablet while the car moved inch by inch through the congestion. His driver, Emeka, sighed quietly. Lagos traffic today is worse than usual, sir. Benedict barely looked up. It always is. Outside the window, vendors knocked gently on car doors, offering bottled water, plantain chips, phone chargers, and sunglasses. The city moved in constant motion, but Benedict's mind was somewhere else. The meeting with investors had ended earlier than expected, leaving him with an unusual gap in his schedule. Normally, he would head directly back to the office, but today, he had decided to stop by a construction site where his company was negotiating a large logistics contract. Work had become his refuge. It was easier to think about shipping routes and contracts than about memories. Yet lately, those memories had begun appearing more often. Small things triggered them. A colleague announcing the birth of a child, a couple laughing together in a restaurant. Even the sight of a family walking down the street sometimes stirred an uncomfortable feeling inside him. He had spent years convincing himself that the past was necessary, that the divorce had been unavoidable, that life simply moved forward. Still, some part of him knew the truth was more complicated. Emeka slowed the car as the traffic light ahead turned red. The SUV stopped beside a busy sidewalk filled with pedestrians. Benedict leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples. Outside the window, life continued in its usual Lagos rhythm. A woman balanced a tray of oranges on her head while weaving through the crowd. A group of school children walked past in bright uniforms, laughing loudly. A motorcycle rider argued with a taxi driver. The scene was ordinary, until Benedict saw her. At first, his mind did not understand what his eyes were seeing. A woman stood near the edge of the sidewalk, holding a small bag of groceries. Her dress was simple, her hair was tied back loosely. She looked thinner than he remembered, but there was no mistaking her face. Adaeze. Benedict felt his body freeze. His heart skipped so suddenly that for a moment he thought something was wrong with him. It had been almost 3 years since he last saw her. 3 years since the day she walked away from their marriage. 3 years since he convinced himself their lives would never cross again. Yet here she was, standing only a few meters away from his car, his breath caught in his throat. But it wasn't just her presence that shocked him. It was what he saw next. Adaeze placed one hand gently over her stomach, and beneath the light fabric of her dress there was no hiding the truth. Her belly was visibly pregnant. The world around Benedict seemed to collapse into silence. Cars continued honking, people continued walking, but he heard nothing, saw nothing except that single detail. Adaeze was pregnant. The same Adaeze doctors had declared unable to carry a child. The same Adaeze he had divorced because of that diagnosis. His mind struggled to process the impossible. "How?" he whispered. Emeka glanced at him through the rearview mirror. But Benedict did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the woman outside the window. Adaeze shifted slightly as if adjusting the grocery bag in her hand. The movement made the shape of her belly even clearer. She was not just pregnant, she was far along, perhaps 6 months, maybe more. Benedict felt a sudden wave of dizziness. His chest tightened painfully. The doctor's words from years earlier echoed violently inside his mind. Carrying a child may not be possible. Yet the evidence stood directly in front of him, alive, real, impossible. The traffic light turned green. Cars began moving again. Emeka said, confused. "Should we go?" "Stop the car," Benedict suddenly shouted. Emeka slammed the brakes. The SUV jerked slightly as vehicles behind them honked angrily. Benedict threw the door open before the car had fully stopped. Emeka called after him, but Benedict was already stepping into the street. Heat, noise, and motion rushed back into his senses. All at once, he barely noticed. His eyes searched the sidewalk desperately. Adaeze had started walking. Adaeze. The name tore from his throat before he could stop himself. She froze. Slowly, she turned around. Their eyes met across the crowded street. For a moment, time seemed to fold backward. Benedict saw the same woman he had once loved. The same calm face. The same quiet strength in her eyes. But now something was different. There was distance there. A life lived without him. Adaeze looked surprised, but not frightened, not angry, just surprised. Benedict tried to step closer, but suddenly the ground beneath him felt unstable. His head spun, his breathing became uneven. All the questions crashing into his mind collided at once. How could she be pregnant? Was the diagnosis wrong? Had someone lied? Whose child was it? The pressure inside his chest grew unbearable. His vision blurred. He reached out instinctively for balance. But there was nothing to hold. The world tilted. Voices around him rose in alarm. "Hey, that man! Someone help him!" Benedict barely heard them. The last thing he saw before darkness rushed over him was Adaeze stepping toward him through the crowd. Her face filled with sudden concern. Then everything went black. When Benedict collapsed onto the hot Lagos pavement that afternoon, he did not yet understand the truth waiting behind that moment. But the answer to the question burning inside his heart would soon emerge. And when he finally learned what had truly happened years earlier, the weight of that truth would bring him to his knees. When Benedict Nwachukwu regained consciousness, the first thing he heard was the distant hum of medical equipment. A soft beeping sound pulsed steadily somewhere near his head. For a moment he did not remember where he was. The ceiling above him was bright white, illuminated by fluorescent lights that felt painfully sharp against his eyes. He blinked slowly. A faint smell of antiseptic filled the air. Hospital. Memory returned in fragments. The traffic, the sidewalk, Adaeze, her pregnant belly. Benedict's chest tightened suddenly as the images rushed back. He tried to sit up. A hand gently pressed against his shoulder. "Easy," a nurse said softly. "You fainted. Your body needs a moment." Benedict's voice came out hoarse. "Where am I, St. Dominic Medical Center?" The nurse replied. "Someone brought you here after you collapsed. Someone." The nurse nodded toward the doorway. "You had a visitor." Benedict turned his head slowly. Standing quietly near the window was Adaeze Okafor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt strangely still. Adaeze stepped closer, her movements calm and measured. "You scared everyone on the street," she said gently. Benedict stared at her. Up close, the reality was even clearer. Her pregnancy was unmistakable now. His throat tightened. You're pregnant." Adaeze nodded quietly. "Yes." The simple confirmation felt like a thunderclap inside his chest. How he whispered. Adaeze looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "I didn't know either. At first." Benedict struggled to sit up again, this time more slowly. The nurse adjusted the pillows behind him before leaving the room. Now they were alone. For the first time in 3 years, Benedict's mind raced with questions. "You said the doctors told you it was impossible," he said carefully. They did, and yet... Adaeze rested one hand gently on her stomach. "Life sometimes surprises us." Her voice carried neither bitterness nor accusation, just quiet acceptance. But Benedict felt something rising inside him, confusion, shock, and something darker, suspicion. "Who is the father?" he asked suddenly. The question hung heavily in the room. Adaeze did not react immediately. Instead, she studied his face carefully. "I wondered how long it would take you to ask that." Benedict swallowed. "I have the right to know." Adaeze nodded slowly. "Yes, you do." But instead of answering directly, she asked a question of her own. "Do you remember the last year of our marriage?" Benedict frowned slightly. "Of course. Do you remember how often we visited doctors?" "Yes, and how certain they all sounded about my condition." Benedict's stomach tightened. "Yes." Adaeze held his gaze. "Then you should also remember something else. What we never stopped trying to have a child." The words landed quietly, but Benedict immediately understood the implication. His eyes widened slightly. "You're saying..." Adaeze spoke gently. "The baby is yours." Silence filled the room. Benedict stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible." Adaeze didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, "I thought the same thing." Benedict shook his head. "The doctor said I know what the doctor said. But if you were already pregnant when we divorced, I wasn't." That stopped him. What Adaeze sighed softly. "The pregnancy happened later." Benedict's confusion deepened. "Then how can you say the baby is mine?" Adaeze looked at him with quiet patience. "Because there has been no other man." Benedict blinked. "You expect me to believe that Adaeze's expression remained calm." "I'm not asking you to believe anything." He ran a hand through his hair, struggling to process the situation. "This doesn't make sense." "I know." Benedict looked at her stomach again. "How far along are you?" "Almost 7 months." His heart skipped. 7 months. He began calculating quickly in his mind. The timeline, the divorce, the months that followed, nothing aligned clearly. "Did the doctors explain this?" he asked. Adaeze nodded. "Yes, and they said my previous diagnosis may have been wrong." Benedict felt something twist inside his chest. "Wrong. Yes. Dr. Okoye was one of the best specialists in Lagos." "I know." "Then how could he be wrong?" Adaeze shrugged gently. "Doctors are human." Benedict fell silent, but the idea refused to settle comfortably in his mind. Something about it felt unfinished, incomplete. If the diagnosis was wrong, he said slowly, then our entire divorce was based on a mistake. Adaeze didn't respond immediately. Finally, she said, "Yes." The word felt like a weight, dropping into the room. Benedict leaned back against the pillow. His head began to ache. 3 years. 3 years of believing something that might not have been true. 3 years of living with the decision to leave the woman he once loved. "If what you're saying is true," he murmured. Adaeze waited quietly. "Then everything that happened between us was unnecessary," she finished gently. Benedict closed his eyes briefly. The thought was unbearable. But another question quickly followed. "Why didn't you tell me when you discovered you were pregnant?" Adaeze's expression softened. "I didn't discover it until recently, and when you did," she hesitated. "By then, our lives had already moved on." Benedict looked at her sharply. "You decided not to tell me." Adaeze shook her head slightly. I didn't know if it would help or hurt. The honesty in her voice disarmed him. Benedict stared at the floor. His thoughts felt tangled. If the doctors had been wrong, if Adaeze had never truly been infertile, then the decision that destroyed their marriage had been based on a lie. And that possibility opened a far more disturbing question. Who had made the mistake? Or worse, who had allowed it to happen? Benedict slowly looked back at Adaeze. "Do you still have your old medical records?" "Yes." "From Dr. Okoye's clinic?" "Yes." Benedict's eyes darkened with determination. "I want to see them." Adaeze studied his face carefully. "Why?" "Because something about this doesn't feel right." She hesitated. "What are you thinking?" Benedict spoke slowly. "If the diagnosis was wrong, I want to know why." Adaeze remained silent, but inside Benedict's mind a troubling suspicion had already begun forming. Because the past no longer felt like a simple tragedy. It felt like a mystery. And the deeper he looked into it, the more he feared discovering that their marriage had not been destroyed by fate, but by something far more deliberate. Benedict did not sleep much that night. After the doctor confirmed he was physically stable, the hospital discharged him in the early evening. Emeka drove him back to his apartment on Victoria Island, but Benedict barely spoke during the ride. His mind replayed the conversation with Adaeze over and over. "The baby is yours!" The words echoed in his head with unsettling persistence. Logic tried to reject the idea. Emotion refused to ignore it. And beneath both of those, a deeper feeling had begun to rise, uneasy suspicion. When he arrived home, Benedict went straight to his study. The room was lined with business files, contracts, and framed certificates, celebrating the growth of his company. Normally, the space gave him a sense of control. Tonight, it felt useless. He sat at his desk, staring at nothing for several minutes. If Adaeze was telling the truth, then everything he had believed about the past was wrong. But the more he thought about it, the more questions appeared. Dr. Okoye had sounded absolutely certain during the consultation years earlier. The diagnosis had not been vague. It had been final. Carrying a child may not be possible. And yet, Adaeze was now 7 months pregnant. Benedict leaned back in his chair, his chest tight with frustration. There were only 2 possibilities. Either the diagnosis had been an honest medical mistake, or someone had interfered. The second possibility made his stomach twist, because if someone had manipulated the truth, then the divorce had not simply been tragic, it had been engineered. Benedict picked up his phone. For a long moment he hesitated. Then he dialed Adaeze's number. She answered after the second ring. "Hello, it's me," Benedict said quietly. There was a short pause. "I know." He exhaled slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the baby, yes." Adaeze waited, and about the diagnosis, he added. I still have the records, she said calmly. I know. You asked to see them. Yes. Then you can. Benedict frowned slightly. You sound very calm about all of this. Adaeze's voice softened. I spent 3 years learning how to live with painful truths. He did not know how to respond to that. Where are the records, he asked. In my apartment. Can I come tomorrow? Another pause. Then she said, yes. The next morning arrived heavy with tension. Benedict arrived in Surulere just after sunrise. The neighborhood was modest compared to Victoria Island rows of closely packed apartment buildings, roadside food stalls, and the constant hum of early morning activity. Children in school uniforms walked along the narrow streets while traders opened their shops. Benedict felt strangely out of place stepping out of his expensive SUV. Yet Adaeze's apartment building stood quietly among the others. She opened the door before he even knocked. Good morning, she said. Morning. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then Adaeze stepped aside. Come in. The apartment was small but neat. A simple couch, a wooden table, a few neatly folded baby clothes resting on a chair. Benedict noticed them immediately. His chest tightened again. Adaeze walked to a cabinet and pulled out a small file folder. These are the records, she said, handing it to him. Benedict opened the folder carefully. Inside were several medical documents, test results, diagnostic reports, and, finally, the official statement from Dr. Chinedu Okoye's clinic. He read the report slowly. The language was clinical and precise. Diagnosis: severe reproductive complications. Likelihood of pregnancy extremely low, the same words that had shattered their marriage. Benedict flipped through the pages again. Something about the documents bothered him. What is it? Adaeze asked quietly. He pointed to one section. These blood test results. What about them? The date. Adaeze leaned closer. What's wrong with it? Benedict tapped the paper. These results were processed 2 days after the samples were taken. That's normal, isn't it? Usually, yes. Benedict frowned. But this lab report is missing the technician's identification code. Adaeze looked confused. What does that mean? Every diagnostic test must include the ID of the lab technician who processed it. Maybe they forgot. Benedict shook his head. Medical labs don't forget things like that. A slow tension filled the room. Adaeze watched him carefully. What are you thinking? Benedict looked back at the document. I think we need to speak with someone who worked at that clinic. Adaeze hesitated. After all this time, yes. Why? Because the more I read these reports, Benedict said quietly, the more something feels wrong. Adaeze folded her arms. What do you expect to find? I don't know yet. She studied his face. You think someone lied? I think someone may have changed something. Adaeze's stomach tightened. But why would anyone do that? Benedict did not answer immediately. Instead, a disturbing memory slowly surfaced in his mind. His mother's voice. I warned you about that girl. You need a wife who will give you children. The thought made his chest feel cold, but he pushed it away quickly. He was not ready to consider that possibility yet. Instead, he said, I want to speak with someone who worked there. Adaeze sighed softly. The clinic closed last year. Benedict looked up. Closed, yes. But some of the staff moved to other hospitals. Do you know where? Adaeze nodded slowly. There was a nurse who helped during our visits. What was her name? Nurse Zainab Musa. Benedict felt a strange jolt of recognition. Zainab Musa. Yes. Are you sure that's the name I remember? Benedict leaned back slightly, because the name sounded familiar. Too familiar. Then he remembered. The doctor who confirmed Adaeze's pregnancy weeks earlier had introduced herself with the same name. Dr. Zainab Musa. Benedict looked up sharply. I think I know where she works now. Adaeze blinked. Where? At the clinic where you confirmed the pregnancy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adaeze whispered, "You think she knows something?" Benedict closed the folder slowly. "If there is a missing piece in this story," he said, "she might be the one who can explain it." But neither of them yet understood how dangerous the truth waiting behind that explanation might be. Because the past they were about to uncover would reveal something far more disturbing than a simple medical mistake, and the person connected to that truth would be someone Benedict Nwachukwu never expected to question. The next morning, Benedict Nwachukwu woke with a determination he had not felt in years. For a long time after his divorce, he had trained himself to accept the past as something unchangeable. Regret had lived quietly in the background of his life, but he had never tried to challenge the events that led to it. Now everything felt different. The possibility that the truth had been distorted intentionally or accidentally had awakened something inside him. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for Adaeze, and for the child she now carried. By mid-morning, Benedict's black SUV pulled into the parking lot of St. Dominic Medical Center, the same clinic where Adaeze's pregnancy had recently been confirmed. The hospital building stood tall and modern, its white exterior reflecting the bright Lagos sun. Inside, nurses moved quickly through the corridors while patients waited in rows of chairs along the walls. Benedict walked directly to the reception desk. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'm looking for Dr. Zainab Musa." The receptionist checked the computer. "She's currently finishing a consultation," she replied. "You may wait." Benedict nodded and sat down. For the next 15 minutes, he watched people come and go. A young couple holding hands nervously, an elderly man being helped into a wheelchair, a mother soothing a crying toddler, scenes of ordinary life. Yet Benedict felt strangely disconnected from it all, because somewhere inside this building was a woman who might hold the key to understanding how his marriage had been destroyed. Finally, a nurse approached him. "Dr. Musa will see you now." Benedict followed her down a quiet hallway and into a small office. Dr. Zainab Musa sat behind her desk, reviewing patient files. She looked up when he entered. Recognition crossed her face instantly. "Mr. Nwachukwu," she said calmly. "You remember me?" Benedict replied. "Yes." Her expression remained professional. "You collapsed on the street 2 days ago." Benedict nodded. "I'm feeling better now." "Good." He took the chair across from her desk. "I came to ask you something." Dr. Musa folded her hands. "About Adaeze." "Yes." She studied him carefully. "I suspected you might return." Benedict leaned forward slightly. "You worked at Dr. Chinedu Okoye's fertility clinic 3 years ago, didn't you?" "Yes." "You were one of the nurses involved in Adaeze's tests." "Yes." Benedict took a breath. "Then you must remember her diagnosis." Dr. Musa's expression remained neutral. "I remember. Dr. Okoye told us she would never carry a child." "Yes." "And yet she is now 7 months pregnant." "Yes." Silence filled the office for a moment. Benedict finally asked the question that had been haunting him. "How is that possible?" Dr. Musa did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a small notebook on her desk and turned it slowly in her hands. "When Adaeze came to this clinic recently," she said quietly, "I recognized her immediately." "You did, yes. Why didn't you say anything? Because I wasn't sure if she remembered me." Benedict frowned. "But you must have realized what this meant." "I did." And Dr. Musa sighed softly. "It made me revisit something that has bothered me for a long time." Benedict's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Dr. Musa looked directly into his eyes. "The test results from that clinic were unusual." His chest tightened. "Unusual how the samples taken from Adaeze did not initially show the severe reproductive damage described in the final report." Benedict's heart skipped. What Dr. Musa nodded slowly. The preliminary data suggested fertility challenges, but not impossibility. Then why did Dr. Okoye say pregnancy was impossible? Dr. Musa hesitated. Because the final report was changed. The words hit Benedict like a shockwave. Changed, yes. By whom Dr. Musa looked down briefly before answering. I never saw the person directly. But I overheard a conversation between Dr. Okoye and someone from outside the clinic. Benedict leaned forward. What kind of conversation the person was asking, whether the diagnosis could be made more definitive. His stomach twisted. Why would anyone want that Dr. Musa met his eyes? I asked myself the same question for years. Did Dr. Okoye explain it? No. What did he say? He said certain families had strong interests in the outcome. The room suddenly felt colder. Benedict's voice dropped. Families. Dr. Musa nodded. Yes. Which family? For a moment, Dr. Musa looked reluctant. Then she said quietly, the woman who visited him that evening said she was your mother. The words struck Benedict like a physical blow. My mother. Yes. His mind immediately flashed to Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu. Her firm voice, her endless insistence on grandchildren, her warnings about Adaeze before the wedding. Benedict felt his stomach churn. You're saying my mother spoke with the doctor? Yes. Are you certain I saw her leave the office? Benedict stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. That doesn't prove anything. No. Dr. Musa agreed, but the timing was suspicious. What timing? The final diagnosis was issued the following day. Benedict ran his hand across his face. This could not be happening. His mother had always been strong-willed, but manipulating a medical diagnosis, destroying a marriage. It sounded impossible, yet the pieces were beginning to align in ways he could no longer ignore. When Adaeze returned here recently, Dr. Musa continued, I decided to review the original files, and the data confirmed what I suspected. Benedict turned back toward her. The test results were not consistent with the final report. You mean, she was never truly infertile? The room fell silent. Benedict felt his knees weaken slightly. For several seconds he could not speak, because in that moment the entire weight of the past crashed down on him. The divorce, Adaeze's heartbreak, 3 years of separation, all built on a lie. And that lie had likely begun inside his own family. His voice trembled when he finally spoke. If what you're saying is true. Dr. Musa waited quietly. Then my marriage was destroyed by manipulation. She nodded slowly. That appears to be the case. Benedict closed his eyes briefly. The truth he had feared was now staring directly at him, and the person connected to that truth was someone he had trusted his entire life, his mother. For a long time after leaving St. Dominic Medical Center, Benedict Nwachukwu sat silently in the back seat of his SUV as Lagos traffic carried him across the city. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting golden light across the lagoon and glass towers of Victoria Island. But Benedict saw none of it. His mind was trapped inside a single unbearable realization. My mother. The words repeated themselves over and over. For years he had believed their divorce was the tragic result of fate, an unfortunate medical truth that no one could change. But if Dr. Zainab Musa was right, then the truth had never been medical. It had been manipulation, and the person who pushed that manipulation forward had likely been Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu. The thought made his chest feel heavy, not just with anger, but with shame, because he had believed the lie. Worse, he had acted on it. He had allowed the diagnosis to become the weapon that ended his marriage. He had watched Adaeze walk away, without fighting for her, and now she was carrying his child. Benedict suddenly leaned forward. Emeka, Yes, sir, changed direction, to wear a nugu. Emeka glanced at him in the mirror, surprised. Now, yes. It was already evening, but Benedict did not care. Some conversations could not wait. The long drive out of Lagos began immediately. For hours, the car sped along the highway, leaving the crowded city behind. Darkness slowly covered the road as villages and roadside markets passed by in flickering headlights. Inside the car, Benedict remained quiet. His thoughts moved between two powerful emotions, guilt and anger. By the time they reached the Nwachukwu family compound in Enugu, the night air had grown cool. The compound looked just as it always had. Large gates, mango trees lining the courtyard, and the familiar house where Benedict had grown up. Lights glowed inside the windows. Mama Ngozi was still awake. When Benedict stepped out of the car, the security guard looked surprised. "Master Benedict, we didn't know you were coming. I need to see my mother. She's inside." Benedict walked straight into the house. Inside the sitting room, Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu sat comfortably in a large chair reading through some documents. She looked up when she heard the door open. "Benedict," she said with surprise. "My son, you should have called before traveling so late." Benedict did not smile. "Mama, we need to talk." Something in his tone made her sit up straighter. "What is wrong?" Benedict walked slowly into the room. "You remember the fertility clinic we visited 3 years ago?" Mama Ngozi's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, the clinic where Dr. Okoye told us Adaeze could never have children." "Yes." Benedict watched her carefully. "I spoke with one of the nurses who worked there." Mama Ngozi's expression remained calm, and she told me the diagnosis was manipulated. For the first time, a flicker of tension crossed his mother's face. "What nonsense is that?" Benedict's voice grew firmer. "She said someone visited the clinic and pressured the doctor to make the diagnosis more severe." Mama Ngozi folded her arms. "Doctors sometimes make mistakes." "Yes," Benedict said quietly. "They do." He took another step closer. But this wasn't a mistake. Mama Ngozi's gaze hardened. "What are you suggesting?" Benedict's heart pounded. "She said the visitor claimed to be my mother." Silence filled the room. For several seconds, Mama Ngozi said nothing. Then she sighed slowly. "So you came all the way to Enugu to accuse me?" "I came to ask if it's true." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Even if I spoke with the doctor, that doesn't mean I changed anything. Did you ask him to make the diagnosis sound hopeless?" She did not answer immediately. "Did you?" Benedict pressed. Finally, Mama Ngozi spoke. "I wanted clarity. That's not what I asked." Her voice rose slightly. "I wanted to protect this family." Benedict felt his chest tighten. "By destroying my marriage, I saved your future." "You destroyed it." Mama Ngozi stood up suddenly. "You think that woman was good for you. She was my wife. She was going to leave you childless. She wasn't infertile." Mama Ngozi hesitated. That brief hesitation told Benedict everything. His voice trembled. "You knew the results were not final. I knew enough. You forced the doctor to lie. I asked him to be honest about the risk. You pushed him to say it was impossible." Mama Ngozi's expression hardened. "Yes," she said finally. Benedict staggered slightly backward. "You admit it." She lifted her chin proudly. "I did what was necessary. You destroyed my marriage. I saved the Nwachukwu bloodline. You broke Adaeze's heart. She was standing in the way of your future." Benedict felt his voice crack. "She was carrying my future." The words exploded into the room. Mama Ngozi froze. What Benedict's hands shook. "Adaeze is pregnant." The room went completely silent. Mama Ngozi's face slowly drained of color. "That is impossible." "That's what the doctor said too." Benedict's chest rose and fell rapidly, but it was a lie. He stepped closer to her. "The baby is mine." Mama Ngozi stared at him in shock. For the first time in his life, Benedict saw genuine uncertainty in his mother's eyes. "She is 7 months pregnant," he continued. "If you hadn't interfered," his voice broke, "we would still be a family." The realization crashed over him all at once. 3 years of separation, 3 years of regret, 3 years of believing a lie. The weight became too much. Benedict felt his knees weaken. He grabbed the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. "Mama," he whispered. His vision blurred. "You destroyed everything." Then the strength left his body. Benedict collapsed onto the floor of the sitting room. Servants rushed into the house in alarm. Mama Ngozi stood frozen in the center of the room. For the first time since the truth had begun to unfold, the consequences of her actions were finally impossible to ignore. And as Benedict lay unconscious once again, the reality of what had been lost could no longer be hidden. When Benedict Nwachukwu opened his eyes again, the world felt strangely quiet. For a moment, he did not remember where he was. The ceiling above him was familiar wooden panels from the house where he had grown up in Enugu. A ceiling fan rotated slowly overhead, pushing cool night air through the room. Then the memories returned. The clinic, Dr. Zainab Musa's revelation, the confrontation with his mother, Adaeze, the baby, and the terrible realization that everything he had destroyed had been built on a lie. Benedict pushed himself slowly into a sitting position. His head still felt heavy, but the dizziness had passed. A soft knock sounded at the door. One of the family servants stepped inside. "Master Benedict, are you feeling better?" "Yes," he said quietly. "The doctor said you fainted from stress. I'll be fine." The servant nodded and hesitated before speaking again. "Your mother is waiting outside." Benedict closed his eyes briefly. "Send her in." A few seconds later, Mama Ngozi Nwachukwu stepped into the room. For the first time in Benedict's life, she looked smaller. Not physically smaller, but diminished in a way that had nothing to do with height or strength. She stood near the door for a moment, unsure of how to begin. "My son." Benedict said nothing. The silence stretched painfully between them. Finally, she spoke again. "I did not think things would go this far." Benedict looked at her slowly. "You didn't think lying about a medical diagnosis would have consequences." Her voice trembled slightly. "I believed I was protecting you. From what? From a future without children." Benedict shook his head. "You were protecting your pride." Mama Ngozi lowered her gaze. "In our culture, family lineage matters. So does truth." She sighed softly. "I asked the doctor to be honest about the risks. You asked him to destroy my marriage." Her shoulders sagged. "I did not force you to divorce her." "No," Benedict admitted quietly. "That part was my weakness." He looked down at his hands. "I believed you." The room fell silent again. Finally, Benedict spoke. "She's 7 months pregnant." Mama Ngozi nodded slowly. "You said that. She is carrying my child." Another nod. "And because of what you did." "I wasn't there for any of it." He stood up from the bed. "I wasn't there when she discovered the pregnancy." He took a step toward the window. "I wasn't there when she faced the fear alone." Another step. "And I wasn't there when she needed someone beside her." His voice tightened. "All because I believed a lie." Mama Ngozi wiped a tear from her eye. "I never wanted to hurt you, but you did." She nodded weakly. "And I hurt Adaeze." "Yes, and I hurt your child." Benedict finally turned back toward her. "Yes." For several seconds they simply looked at each other. Then, Mama Ngozi said quietly, "What will you do now?" Benedict answered without hesitation. "I'm going back to Lagos, to Adaeze, yes." Mama Ngozi swallowed. "Will you ask her to come back?" Benedict shook his head slowly. "No." "Why not?" "Because that decision belongs to her now." Mama Ngozi nodded. You're right. Benedict picked up his jacket from the chair. I will ask for forgiveness, and if she refuses, then I will accept it. He paused near the door. But I will still be there for my child. Mama Ngozi's voice trembled. Will you ever forgive me? Benedict did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, forgiveness takes time. Then he left the room. The drive back to Lagos began before sunrise. By midday, Benedict stood outside Adaeze's apartment in Surulere. His heart pounded harder with every step toward the door. When he knocked, Adaeze opened it a few seconds later. She looked surprised to see him. You came back. Yes. She stepped aside. Come in. Benedict entered the small living room. For a moment, he didn't know how to begin. Finally, he said, I spoke with Dr. Musa. Adaeze's expression softened slightly, and she told me everything. Adaeze lowered herself into a chair. So you know. Yes. Benedict took a slow breath. My mother admitted it. Adaeze closed her eyes briefly. I thought so. I'm sorry. The words came out quietly, but with deep sincerity. Adaeze looked at him. You weren't the only one who believed the diagnosis. I should have fought harder for us. You were under pressure. That's not an excuse. He stepped closer. I failed you. Adaeze studied him carefully. The silence stretched. Then she spoke gently. You can't change the past, Benedict. I know. But the future is still open. He nodded. I don't expect you to take me back. Adaeze's eyes softened. That's good. A faint smile appeared. Because I'm not ready for that conversation. Benedict almost laughed with relief. I didn't come to claim anything. Then why did you come? He placed a hand over his heart. To take responsibility. Adaeze watched him carefully. For what for you? He gestured gently toward her stomach. And for our child. Adaeze remained quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. The child will need a father. I intend to be one. And what about the rest of us? Benedict looked at her with honesty. That will depend on time. Adaeze leaned back slightly. Time has already changed many things. Yes, but maybe it can heal some things too. She studied him for several seconds. Then she said softly, We'll see. For the first time in years, Benedict felt something he had not allowed himself to feel. Hope. Not the naive hope of the past, but the careful, patient hope of someone willing to rebuild slowly. Outside the apartment window, Lagos continued moving with its usual unstoppable rhythm. But inside that small room, something fragile and new had begun. Not a perfect ending, but a beginning. Life has a strange way of revealing truth when we least expect it. Sometimes the greatest tragedies in our lives are not caused by fate or destiny, but by fear, pressure, and decisions made too quickly. Benedict and Adaeze's story reminds us of something deeply human. Love can be fragile when outside voices become louder than the quiet truth inside our hearts. In many communities around the world, expectations about family, children, and tradition carry enormous weight. These expectations can sometimes push people into choices they later regret. But this story also teaches another powerful truth. Even after betrayal, misunderstanding, and loss, healing is still possible. Forgiveness does not always mean returning to the past. Sometimes it simply means allowing the future to grow without bitterness. Adaeze found strength in rebuilding her life with dignity. Benedict found the courage to confront the truth and take responsibility for his mistakes. And their child became a symbol of something larger than both of them. A reminder that life does not always follow the plans we create, but it often brings second chances for those willing to face the truth. If this story touched your heart, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Benedict's situation? Do you believe some mistakes can truly be forgiven? And if stories like this inspire you, stories about love, truth, justice, and second chances, Please remember to like the video, share it with someone who might need this message, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from Africa and beyond. Your support helps us keep telling these meaningful stories. Thank you for watching.